Hello, everyone, and welcome to my channel. Today we want to talk to you about a very interesting topic that is often ignored by our society, the people who have suffered the longest prison sentences of all time. These stories are incredible and serve to make us reflect on justice, freedom, and humanity. During the video, we will examine some emblematic cases of people who have spent decades, even more than a century, in the prisons of their respective nations. These stories are an important reminder of our history and help us understand the problems of justice and freedom. Oscar Wilde. The first case we want to examine is that of Oscar Wilde, a famous English writer and poet who spent 3 years and 9 months in prison for homosexuality. Wilde was arrested in 1895 and sentenced to 2 years in prison, but was released on parole after 2 years. However, he was forced to return to prison for breaking the conditions of his release. Wilde's sentence was extremely harsh and left him deeply traumatized. His own family abandoned him, and his reputation was destroyed. After his release, Wilde died of tuberculosis in 1900 at the age of just 46. Nelson Mandela. The next case we want to look at is that of Nelson Mandela, the South African leader who spent 27.5 years in prison for fighting against apartheid. Mandela was arrested in 1962 and sentenced to life in prison for restitution for services and subversive activities. However, he was released in 1990 after the fall of the South African regime. Mandela's story is incredible and serves as an example of courage and dedication. Despite his long imprisonment, Mandela never gave up his ideas and hopes for the future. After his release, he became the first Black president of South Africa and worked to build a more equal and just society. Anatoly Buchovsky. The next case we want to look at is that of Anatoly Buchovsky, a Russian who spent 32 years and 8 months in prison for killing a police officer in an accident. Buchovsky was arrested in 1969 and sentenced to 25 years in prison, but was released in 2001. Buchovsky's story is incredible and serves as an example of the harsh Soviet justice system. Buchovsky was forced to work in the coal mine in Norilsk, one of the harshest places in the Soviet Union, and spent many years away from his family. Charles Manson. The next case we want to look at is that of Charles Manson, an American serial killer who spent 46 years in prison for the murders of a family in Calabasas, near Los Angeles. Manson was arrested in 1969 and sentenced to death, but was released in 2012 due to his health condition. Manson's story is incredible and serves as an example of human madness and cruelty. Manson was a violent cult leader who attacked a family and killed 2 people. However, Manson was not guilty of the murder, but was still sentenced to death for his crimes. The founder of the Manson family, whose murderous crimes are constantly recurring and speak of the manipulation of vulnerable minds, spent 46 years in prison before his death in 2017. These fearsome figures raise questions about punishment and why some crimes are punished more severely than others.
Giovanni Leone.
The next case we want to look at is that of Giovanni Leone, an Italian who spent 25 years in prison for the murder of his lover. Leone was arrested in 1950 and sentenced to 15 years in prison, but was released in 1975. Leone's story is incredible and serves as an example of the harshness of Italian justice. Leone was forced to work in the coal mine of Enna, one of the harshest places in Italy, and spent many years away from his family. Paul Geidel. One of the most extraordinary cases in American history is that of Paul Geidel, a man who spent 68 years in prison. Geidel was arrested in 1911 following the murder of an 81-year-old woman in New York. Initially sentenced to life in prison, Geidel became the longest-serving inmate in an American penitentiary. What makes his story particularly unique is that, despite always maintaining his innocence, Geidel spent much of his life in prisons in states such as Sing Sing and Green Haven. During his years in prison, he underwent enormous social and cultural changes. He was released from prison in 1980 at the age of 86, and his story became representative of the injustices of the penal system. His release was greeted with a mixture of disbelief and compassion. Richard Anderson, an African-American man, spent 45 years behind bars following an unjust murder conviction, which turned out to be a gross violation of human rights. Arrested in 1975, Anderson was convicted based on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of a dubious witness. What is fascinating about his story is that Anderson fought for his innocence for decades. During his years in prison, he became an activist helping other inmates obtain justice. His fight culminated in 2020, when further investigations finally proved his innocence. His release was celebrated as a victory for the movement against racial and criminal injustice. Leonard Peltier. Leonard Peltier, a civil rights activist and member of the Lakota Nation, was convicted in 1977 of murdering 2 FBI agents on the Indian Reservation in South Dakota. Despite serious doubts about his guilt, Peltier has been held in a U.S. prison for over 45 years, making him one of the longest-serving political prisoners in American history. His conviction was marred by numerous human rights violations and a flawed trial. Peltier has consistently maintained that he was charged without any evidence and that the U.S. government was attempting to silence a critical voice within indigenous communities. Despite his conviction, many continue to fight for his release, seeing him as a symbol of the Native American struggle for human rights. Sholam Weiss is another notable case, a man who spent 27 years in a U.S. federal prison for fraud and money laundering. Weiss was involved in an elaborate fraud scheme that resulted in the loss of millions of dollars for his investors. What makes his story unique is that Weiss, while serving his sentence, converted to a life of faith and humanitarian service, becoming a motivational speaker and counselor for other inmates. He regularly speaks about criminal justice and the importance of rehabilitation. His story is a reminder that even people who make mistakes can find a path to change. Edward Lee Elmore spent 30 years in South Carolina prison for a crime he didn't commit. Arrested in 1982 for the murder of an elderly woman, his conviction was based on questionable evidence and a markedly unfair trial. After years of legal battles, in 2012, new scientific tests proved his innocence. Elmore's case raised important questions about the use of forensic science in the justice system and the need for significant reform. His release attracted media attention and sparked a national conversation about criminal justice. Manuel Noriega. Manuel Noriega, a former leader of Panama, spent 20 years in prison in the United States for drug trafficking, murder, and corruption. After his capture in 1989, Noriega was extradited to serve his sentence, although his journey from politics to crime remains shrouded in mystery. Noriega's life has attracted much attention for his involvement in power games between the United States and his home country. After serving his sentence, Noriega was extradited to France to serve additional years in prison, demonstrating how the consequences of political actions can ripple through an individual's life. Albert Woodfix. Albert Woodfix's life has been marked by over 43 years of solitary confinement in a Louisiana prison. Wrongfully convicted of the murder of a prison guard, Woodfix has always proclaimed his innocence. His conditions of detention have raised international concerns about the use of solitary confinement as a form of punishment. After a long legal battle, Woodfix was finally released in 2015. During his detention, he wrote about how he maintained his humanity, turning his experience into a work of art and a book. His story has become a symbol of resilience and has highlighted the need for reform in prison systems. Dahmer, Bundy, and Manson. Paradigm of punishment. While Oscar Wilde, Nelson Mandela, and other cases of injustice touch our hearts, there are also stories of notorious criminals like Jeffrey Dahmer, Ted Bundy, and Charles Manson, who spent decades in prison. Although their crimes are very different in nature, their stories confront us with ethical questions about punishment, rehabilitation, and justice. Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested in 1991 and sentenced to 15 life sentences for gruesome murders involving cannibalism. As society was outraged by his actions, Dahmer became a case study in the horrific depths of the human psyche. His life in prison was marked by sudden changes in behavior, revealing the complexity of evil. Ted Bundy, another infamous criminal, with a criminal career spanning the 1970s, managed to elude justice for years before being caught. Sentenced to death, he served years of trials and appeals, captivating the public and fueling a cult around his tragic figure. David S. David S., a 70-year-old man, is an emblematic example of a prolonged prison sentence. Sentenced to life in prison for drug-related crimes, S. served over 40 years in prison. Despite his 70 years and poor health, David was not a man to be underestimated. In the final stages of his sentence, he joined rehabilitation programs and became a mentor to younger people trying to avoid his fate. David's release was a celebration. His example pushed institutions to consider the importance of rehabilitation rather than punishment alone. His story makes us reflect on the balance between justice and compassion. Fana Naumov. Finally, let's talk about Fana Naumov, an Eastern European political activist who spent 20 years in prison because of her political views and her involvement in the human rights movement. Arrested during a repressive regime, Naumov encountered torture and inhumane conditions of detention. His resilience and ability to resist inspired the struggle for freedom of other political prisoners, making his story a beacon of hope. After his release, he became a speaker and advocate for human rights, working to ensure that past violations are not forgotten. In this video, we explore the incredible stories of individuals who have endured lengthy sentences, facing a wide range of injustices, miscarriages of justice, and struggles for rehabilitation. These cases are not only stories of suffering, but also of resilience, hope, and change. Each story represents a chapter in the long narrative of justice and the struggle for human rights around the world. The injustices that many of these individuals have suffered should serve as a reminder to all of us of the importance of justice, compassion, and understanding. The people we meet through these stories are not just names and numbers, but human beings with dreams, experiences, and stories that deserve to be heard. Their struggle invites us to reflect on how we can work together for a more just, equitable, and humane society. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope these stories have touched your heart and inspired you to speak out for justice and freedom in your world.